Section 1 of Black Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Molly Craig. Black Magic by Marjorie Bowen. Part 1, The Nun. Chapter 1, Sunshine. In the large room of a house in a certain quiet city in Flanders, a man was gilding a devil. The chamber looked on to the quadrangle round which the house was built, and the sun, just overhead, blazed on the vine leaves clinging to the brick and sent a reflected glow into the sombre spaces of the room. The devil, rudely cut out of wood, rested by his 3 tails and his curled back horns against the wall, and the man sat before him on a low stool. On the table in front of the open window stood a row of knights in fantastic armour, roughly modelled in clay. Beside them was a pile of vellum sheets covered with drawings in brown and green. By the door a figure of Saint Michael leant against a chair, and round his feet were painted glasses of every colour and form. On the whitewashed wall hung a winged picture representing a martyrdom. Its vivid hues were the most brilliant thing in the room. The man was dressed in brown. He had a long, dark face and straight, dull hair. From the roll of gold leaf on his knee he carefully and slowly gilded the devil. The place was utterly silent, the perfect stillness enhanced by the dazzle of the blinding sun without. Presently the man rose, and crossing to the window looked out. He could see the sparse plants bordering the neglected, grass-grown paths, the house opposite with its double row of empty windows, and the yellowing vine leaves climbing up the tiled roof that cut the polished blue of the August sky. The man at the window rested his elbows on the sill. It was so hot that he felt it burning through his sleeve. He had the air of one habitually alone, the unquestioning calm that comes of long silences. He was young, and in a quiet fashion well-looking, wide in the brows and long in the jaw, with a smooth pale skin and cloudy dark eyes. His hair hung very straightly. His throat was full and beautiful. In expression he was reserved and sombre. His lips, well-shaped but pale, were resolutely set, and there was a fine curve of strength to his prominent chin. After a time of expressionless gazing at the sun-filled garden, he turned back into the room and stood in the centre of the floor, with his teeth set in his forefinger, looking ponderingly at the half-gilded devil. Then he took a bunch of beautifully wrought keys from his belt, and swinging them softly in his hand, left the chamber. Many curious and gorgeous objects were in those deserted rooms: carved presses full of tarnished silver, paintings of holy subjects, furniture covered with rich-hued tapestry, other pieces of arras on the walls, and in one chamber purple silk hangings worked with ladies' hair in shades of brown and gold. One room was full of books piled up on the floor, and in the midst of them stood a table bearing strange goblets of shells set in silver and electrum. Passing these things without a glance, the young man mounted to the upper story and unlocked a door whose rusty lock took his utmost strength to turn. It was a storeroom he entered, lit by low, long windows looking on the street and carefully shrouded by linen drawn across them. The chamber was chokingly full of dust and a sickly, musty smell. About the floor lay bales of stuff, scarlet, blue and green painted tiles, old lanterns, clothes, priests' garments wonderfully worked, glasses and little rusty iron coffers. Before one of these the young man went on his knees and unlocked it. It contained a number of bits of glass cut to represent gems. He selected 2 of an equal size and a clear green colour. Then, with the same gravity and silence with which he had come, he returned to the workshop. When he saw the devil, half bright gold, half bald wood, he frowned, then set the green glass in the thing's hollow eye sockets. At the twinkling effect of the light and life produced by this, his frown relaxed. He stood for a while contemplating his handiwork, then washed his brushes and put away his paints and gold leaf. By now the sun had changed and was shining full into the room, casting hot shadows of the vine leaves over the little clay knights and dazzling Saint Michael's wet red robe. For the second time the young man left the room, now to go into the hall and open the door that gave upon the street. He looked on to an empty marketplace surrounded by small houses falling into decay, beyond them the double towers of the cathedral flying upwards across the golden blue. The young man shaded his eyes and gazed across the dazzling dreariness. The shadow of his slack, slim figure was cast into the square of sun thrown across the hall through the open door. Under the iron bell that hung against the lintel stood a basket of bread, a can of milk, and some meat wrapped in a linen cloth. The youth took these in and closed the door. He traversed a large dining room, finely furnished, a small antechamber, came out into the arcaded end of the courtyard, entered the house by a low door next the pump, and so into his workshop again. There he proceeded to prepare his food. On the wide tiled hearth stood a tripod and an iron pot. He lit a fire under this, filled the pot with water, and put the meat in. Then he took a great book down off a shelf and bent over it, huddled up on a stool in the corner where the shade still lingered. It was a book filled with drawings of strange and horrible things, and close writing embellished with blood-red capitals. As the young man read, his face grew hot and flushed where it rested on his hand, and the heavy volume fell cumbrous either side his knee. Not once did he look up or change his twisted position, but with parted lips and absorbed eyes pored over the black lettering. The sun sank the other side of the house, so that the garden and room were alike in shadow, and the air became cooler. Still the young man made no movement. The flames leapt on the hearth, and the meat seethed in the pot unheeded. Outside, the vine leaves curled against the brick, and the stone faces looked down at the broken fountain, the struggling grass, and the tall white daisies. Still the young man, bending lower, his heated cheek pressed into his palm, his hair touching the page, bent over the great tomb on his knee. Not the devil with his green eyes staring before him, not Saint Michael in his red robe by the door, not the martyr in the bright winged picture were more still than he, crouched upon his wooden stool. Then, without prelude or warning, the heavy clang of a bell woke the silence into trembling echoes. The young man dropped the book and sprang to his feet. Red and white chased across his face. He stood panting, bewildered, with one hand on his heart and dazed eyes. Again the bell sounded. It could only be that which hung at the front door. Not for years had one rung it. He picked up the book, put it back on the shelf, and stood irresolute. For a third time the iron clang, insistent, impatient, rang through the quiet. The young man frowned, pushed back the hair from his hot forehead, and went with a light and cautious step across the courtyard, through the dark dining chamber into the hall. Here for a second he hesitated, then drew back the bolt and opened the door. Two men stood without. One was most gorgeously attired, the other wore a dark cloak and carried his hat in his hand. "You cannot want me," said the youth, surveying them, "and there is no one else here." The splendidly dressed stranger answered, "If you are Master Dirk Renswoude, we are most desirous to see and speak with you." The young man opened the door a little wider. "I am Dirk Renswoude, but I know neither of you." "I did not think so," the other answered. "Still, we have a matter to ask you of. I am Balthasar of Courtrai, and this is my friend, whom you may call Thierry, born of Dendermonde." "Balthasar of Courtrai," repeated the youth softly. He stood aside and motioned them to enter. "Will you follow me?" he added, and went before them to his workroom. The sun had left chamber and garden now, but the air was golden warm with it, and a sense of great heat still lay over the grass and vines seen through the open window. Dirk Renswoude moved St. Michael from the chair and tossed a pile of parchments off a stool. He offered these seats to his guests, who accepted them in silence. "You must needs wait till the supper is prepared," he said, and with that placed himself on the stool by the pot, and while he stirred it with an iron spoon, openly studied the two men. Balthasar of Courtrai was gorgeous. His age might be perhaps 26 or 7. He was of a large make, florid in face with a high red colour and blunt features. His brows were straight and over fair, his eyes deep blue and expressionless. His heavy yellow hair was cut low on his forehead and fell straightly on to his neck. He wore a flat orange hat, slashed and cut, fastened by purple cords to the shoulder of a gold doublet that opened on a shirt of fine lawn. His sleeves were enormous, fantastic, puffed and gathered. Round his waist was a linked belt into which were thrust numerous daggers and a short sword. His breeches of a most vivid blue were beruffled with knots and tassels. His riding boots that came to his knees, stained with the summer dust, showed a small foot decorated with gilt spurs. He sat with one hand on his hip, and in the other held his leather gloves. Such the picture Master Dirk Renswoude, considering him coldly, formed of Balthasar of Courtrai. His companion was younger, dressed sombrely in black and violet, but as well-looking as a man may be. He was neither dark nor fair, but of a clear brown hue, and his eyes were hazel, swift and brilliant. His mouth was set smilingly, yet the whole face expressed reserve and some disdain. He had laid his hat on the floor beside him, and with an interested glance was observing the room. But Balthasar of Courtrai returned Master Dirk Renswoude's steady gaze. "You have heard of me?" he said suddenly. "Yes," was the instant answer. "Then, belike you know what I am here for?" "No," said Master Dirk, frowning. Balthasar glanced at his companion, who gave no heed to either of them, but stared at the half-gilded devil with interest and some wonder. Seeing this, Balthasar answered for himself in a manner half defiant and wholly arrogant. "My father is Margrave of East Flanders, and the Emperor knighted me when I was 15. Now I am tired of Courtrai, of the castle, of my father. I have taken the road." "The road to where?" Dirk asked. Balthasar made a large gesture with his right hand. "To Cologne, perhaps to Rome, to Constantinople, to Turkey or Hungary." "Knight errant," said Master Dirk. Balthasar tossed his fine head. "By the rood, no, I have ambitions." Master Dirk laughed. "And your friend?" he asked. "A wandering scholar," smiled Balthasar, "also weary of the town of Courtrai. He dreams of fame." Thierry looked round at this. "I am going to the universities," he said quietly. "To Paris, Bâle, Padua. You have heard of them?" The youth's cloudy eyes gleamed. "Ah, I have heard of them," he replied upon a quick breath. Master Dirk was moving about, setting the supper. He placed the little clay knights on the window-sill, and flung without any ado drawings, paints and brushes onto the floor. Silence fell on them. The young host's bearing did not encourage comment, and the atmosphere of the room was languid and remote. not conducive to talk. Master Dirk, composed and aloof, opened a press in the wall, and took thence a fine cloth that he laid smoothly on the rough table. He then set on it earthenware dishes and plates, drinking glasses painted in bright colours, and forks with agate handles. They were well served for food, even though it might not be the princely fare the Margrave's son was used to. Honey in a silver jar, shining apples lying among their leaves, wheaten cakes in a plated basket, grapes on a gold salver, lettuces and radishes fragrantly wet. These Master Dirk brought from the press and set on the table. Then he helped his guests to meat, and Balthasar spoke. " You live strangely here, so much alone." " I have no desire for company. I work and take pleasure in it. They buy my work, pictures, carvings, sculptures, for churches, very readily." " You are a good craftsman," said Theirry. " Who taught you?" " Old Master Lucas, born of Ghent, and taught in Italy. When he died he left me this house and all it holds." Again their speech sank into silence. Balthasar ate heavily, but with elegance. Dirk, seated next the window, rested his chin on his palm and stared out at the bright yet fading blue of the sky, at the row of closed windows opposite, and the daisies waving round the broken fountain. He ate very little. Theirry, placed opposite, was of the same mind, and paying little heed to Balthasar, who seemed not to interest him in the least, kept curious eyes on Dirk's strange grave face. After a while the Margrave's son asked shamelessly for wine, and the youth rose languidly and brought it. Tall bottles, white, red, and yellow in wicker cases, and an amber-hued beer such as the peasants drank. The placing of these before Balthasar seemed to rouse him from his apathy. "Why have you come here?" he demanded. Balthasar laughed easily. "I am married," he said as a prelude, and lifted his glass in a large, well-made hand. At that Master Dirk frowned. "So are many men." Balthasar surveyed the tilting wine through half-closed eyes. "It is about my wife, master, that I am here now." Dirk Renswoude leant forward in his chair. " I know of your wife." " Tell me of her," said Balthasar of Courtrai. " I have come here for that." Dirk slightly smiled. " Should I know more than you?" The Margrave's son flushed. " What do you know? Tell me." Dirk's smile deepened. " She was one Ursula, daughter of the Lord of Rooselaare. She was sent to the convent of the White Sisters in this town." " So you know it all," said Balthasar. " Well, what else?" " What else? Must I tell you a familiar tale?" " Certes, more so to you than to me." " Then, since you wish it, here is your story, sir. She was educated for a nun, and, I think, desired to become one of the Order of the White Sisters. But when she was 15 her brother died, and she became her father's heiress. So many entered the lists for her hand, they contracted her to you." Balthasar pulled at the orange tassels on his sleeve. " Without my wish or consent," he said. The young man took no heed. " They sent a guard to bring her back to Rooselaare, but because they were fearful of the danger of journey, and that she might be captured by one of the pretenders to her fortunes, they married her fast and securely, by proxy, to you. At this the maid, who wished most heartily, I take it, to become a nun, fell ill of grief, and in her despair she confided her misery to the abbess. I tell you a tale that I believe you know, but since you have come to hear me speak on that matter, I relate what has come to me of it. This Ursula was heiress to great wealth, and in her love to the sisters and her dislike to this marriage She promised them all her worldly goods, when she should come into possession of them, if they would connive at saving her from her father and her husband. So the nuns, tempted by greed, spread the report that she had died in her illness, and being clever women, they blinded all. There was a false funeral, and Ursula was kept secret in the convent among the novices. All this matter was put into writing and attested by the nuns, that there might be no doubt of the truth of it when the maid came into her heritage, and the news went to her home that she was dead. " And I was glad of it," said Balthasar, " for then I loved another woman and was in no need for money." " Peace, shameless," said Theirry, but Dirk Renswoude laughed softly. She took the final irrevocable vows and lived for 3 years among the nuns, and the life became bitter and utterly unendurable to her, and she dared not make herself known to her father because of the deeds the nuns held, promising them her lands. So as the life became more and more horrible to her, she wrote in her extremity and found means to send a letter to her husband. " I have it here." Balthasar touched his breast. " She said she had sworn herself to me before she had vowed herself to God, told me of her deceit," he laughed, " and asked me to come and rescue her." Dirk crossed his hands that were long and beautiful upon the table. " You did not come, and you did not answer." The Margrave's son glanced at Theirry, as he had a habit of doing, as if he reluctantly desired his assistance or encouragement, but again he obtained nothing, and answered for himself, after the slightest pause, " No, I did not come. Her father had taken another wife, and had a son to inherit, and I "— he lowered his eyes moodily —" I was thinking of another woman. She had lied, my wife, to God, I think. Well, let her take her punishment, I said." " She did not wait beyond some months for your answer," said Master Dirk. " Master Lukas, born of Ghent, was employed in the chapel of the convent, and she, who had to wait on him, told him her story. And when he had finished the chapel she fled with him here to this house, and again she wrote to her husband, speaking of the old man who had befriended her and telling him of her abode. And again he did not answer. That was 5 years ago." " And the nuns made no search for her?" asked Theirry. " They knew now that the girl was no heiress, and they were afraid that the tale might get blown abroad. Then there was war. The convent was burnt and the sisters fled," continued Dirk. " And the maid lived here, learning many crafts from Master Lukas. He had no apprentices but us." Balthasar leant back in his chair. " That much I learnt, and that the old man, dying, left his place to you — and what more of this Ursula?" The young man gave him a slow, full glance. " Strangely late you inquire after her, Balthasar of Courtrai." The knight turned his head away, half sullenly. " A man must know how he is encumbered. No one save I is aware of her existence, yet she is my wife." The young sculptor rested his smooth pale face on his palm. Cloudy eyes and cloudy hair were hardly discernible in the twilight, but the line of the resolute chin was clear cut. " She died 4 years ago," he said, " and her grave is in the garden where those white daisies grow." End of section 1. Recording by Molly Craig. Section 2 of Black Magic by Marjorie Bowen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1, Chapter 2, The Students. "Dead," repeated Balthasar. He pushed back his chair and then laughed. " Why, so is my difficulty solved. I am free of that, Theirry." His companion frowned. "Do you take it so? I think it is pitiful. The fool was so young. He turned to Dirk. "Of what did she die?" The sculptor sighed, as if weary of the subject. "I know not. She was happy here, yet she died." Balthasar rose. "Why did you bury her within the house?" he asked, half uneasily. "It was in time of war," answered Dirk. "We did what we could, and she, I think, had wished it." The knight turned with a little start and crossed himself. "God grant that she sleep in peace," he cried. "Amen," said Theirry gravely. Dirk took a lantern from the wall and lit it from the coals still burning on the hearth. "Now you know all I know of this matter," he remarked. "I thought that some day you might come. I have kept for you her ring — your ring." Balthasar interrupted. "I want none of it," he said hastily. Dirk lifted the lantern. Its fluttering flame flushed the twilight with gold. "Will you please to sleep here to night?" he asked. The knight, with his back to the window, assented, in defiance of a secret dislike to the place. "Follow me," commanded Dirk. Then, to the other, "I shall be back anon." "Good rest," nodded Balthasar. "To-morrow we will get horses in the town and start for Cologne." The knight went after his host through the silent rooms, up a twisting staircase into a low chamber looking on to the quadrangle. It contained a wooden bedstead covered with a scarlet quilt, a table and some richly carved chairs. Dirk lit the candles standing on the table, bade his guest a curt good night, and returned to the workroom. He opened the door of this softly and looked in before he entered. By the window stood Theirry, striving to catch the last light on the pages of a little book he held. Dirk pushed the door wide and stepped in softly. " You love reading," he said, and his eyes shone. "Ay, and you?" Theirry asked tentatively. " Master Lucas left me his manuscripts among his other goods," Dirk answered. " Being much alone, I have read them." In the lantern light that the air breathed from the garden fanned into a flickering glow, the two young men looked at each other. An extraordinary expression, like a guilty excitement, came into the eyes of each. " Being much alone," whispered Theirry, " with a dead maid in the house. How have you spent your time?" Dirk crouched away against the wall. His hair hung lankly over his pallid face. " You pitied her? You would have come?" questioned Dirk. " When she sent to you?" " I should have seen no other thing to do," answered Theirry. " What manner of a maid was she?" " I did think her fair," said Dirk slowly. " She had yellow hair. You may see her likeness in that picture on the wall, but now it is too dark." Theirry came round the table. " You also follow knowledge?" he inquired eagerly. Dirk caught up the lantern. " You are not aware of the nature of my studies?" he cried, and his eyes shone wrathfully. " Come to bed, I am weary of talking." Theirry bent his head. " This is a fair place for silences," he said. As if gloomily angry, yet disdaining the expression of it, Dirk conducted him to a chamber close to that where Balthasar lay, and left him without speech, nor did Theirry solicit any word of him. Dirk did not return to the workroom, but went into the garden and paced to and fro under the stars that burnt fiercely and seemed to hang very low over the dark line of the house. His walk was hasty, his steps uneven. He bit, with an air of absorbed distraction, his lip, his finger, the ends of his straight hair, and now and then he looked with tumultuous eyes up at the heavens, down at the ground and wildly about him. It was well into the night when he at last returned into the house, and taking a candle in his hand, went stealthily up to Balthasar's chamber. With a delicate touch he unfastened the door and very lightly entered. Shielding the candle flame with his hand, he went up to the bed. The young knight lay heavily asleep, his yellow hair was tumbled over his flushed face and about the pillow. His arms hung slackly outside the red coverlet. On the floor were his brilliant clothes, his sword, his belt, his purse. Where his shirt fell open at the throat, a narrow blue cord showed a charm attached. Dirk stood still, leaning forward a little, looking at the sleeper, and expressions of contempt, of startled anger, of confusion, of reflection passed across his haggard features. Balthasar did not stir in his deep sleep. Neither the light held above him nor the intense gaze of the young man's dark eyes served to wake him, and after a while Dirk left him and passed to the chamber opposite. There lay Theirry fully dressed on his low couch. Dirk set the candle on the table and came on tiptoe to his side. The scholar's fair face was resting on his hand, his chin up-tilted, his full lips a little apart. His lashes lay so lightly on his cheek it seemed he must be glancing from under them. His hair, dark, yet shining, was heaped round his temples. Dirk, staring down at him, breathed furiously, and the colour flooded his face, receded, and sprang up again. Then, retreating to the table, he sank on to the rush-bottomed chair and put his hands over his eyes. The candle flame leapt in unison with his uneven breaths. Looking round after a while with a wild glance, he gave a long, distraught sigh, and Theirry moved in his sleep. At this the watcher sat expectant. Theirry stirred again, turned, and rose on his elbow with a start. Seeing the light and the young man sitting by it, staring at him with brilliant eyes, he set his feet to the ground. Before he could speak, Dirk put his finger on his lips. " Hush," he whispered. " Balthasar is asleep." Theirry, startled, frowned. " What do you want with me?" For answer the young sculptor moaned and dropped his head into the curve of his arm. " You are strange," said Theirry. Dirk glanced up. " Will you take me with you to Padua, to Basle?" he said. " I have money and some learning." " You are free to go, as I," answered Theirry, but awakened interest shone in his eyes. " I would go with you," insisted Dirk intensely. " Will you take me?" Theirry rose from the bed uneasily. " I have had no companion all my life," he said. " The man whom I would take into my confidence must be of rare quality." He came to the other side of the table and across the frail gleam of the candle looked at Dirk. Their eyes met and instantly sank, as if each were afraid of what the other might reveal. " I have studied somewhat," said Dirk hoarsely. " You also, I think, in the same science." The silent awe of comprehension fell upon them. Then Theirry spoke. " So few understand. Can it be possible that you?" Dirk rose. " I have done something." Theirry paled, but his hazel eyes were bright as flame. " How much?" Then he broke off. " God help us." " Ah, do you use that name?" cried Dirk, and showed his teeth. The other, with cold fingers, clutched at the back of the rush-bottomed chair. " So it is true. You deal with — you — ah, you!" " What was that book you were reading?" asked Dirk sharply. There was a pause, then Dirk crushed the candle out with his open palm and answered on a half sob of excitement. " Black magic — black magic." End of Section 2. Recording by Molly Craig. Section 3 of Black Magic by Marjorie Bowen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1, Chapter 3, The Experiment. " I guessed it," said Theirry under his breath, " when I entered the house." " And you?" came Dirk's voice. " I also." There was silence. Then Dirk groped his way to the door. " Come after me," he whispered. There is a light downstairs." Theirry had no words to answer. His throat was hot, his lips dry with excitement. He felt his temples pulsating and his brow damp. Cautiously they crept down the stairs and into the workroom, where the lantern cast long, pale rays of light across the hot dark. Dirk set the window as wide as it would go and crouched into the chair under it. His face was flushed, his hair tumbled, his brown clothes dishevelled. " Tell me about yourself," he said. " What do you want to know?" Theirry asked, half desperately. " I can do very little." " I have no chance to learn," Dirk whispered. " Master Lukas had some books — not enough — but what one might do." " I came upon old writings," said Theirry slowly. " I thought one might be great that way. So I fled from Courtrai." Dirk rose and beckoned. " I will work a spell to night — you shall see." He took up the lantern and Theirry followed him. They traversed the chamber and entered another. In the centre of that Dirk stopped and gave the light into the cold hand of his companion. " Here we shall be secret," he murmured, and raised with some difficulty a trap door in the floor. Theirry peered into the blackness revealed below. " Have you done this before?" he asked fearfully. " This spell? No." Dirk was descending the stairs into the dark. " God will never forgive," muttered Theirry, hanging back. " Are you afraid?" asked Dirk wildly. Theirry set his lips. " No, no." He stepped on to the ladder and, holding the light above his head, followed. They found themselves in a large vault entirely below the surface of the ground, so that air was attained only from the trap door that they had left open behind them. Floor and walls were paved with smooth stones, the air was thick and intolerably hot, the roof only a few inches above Theirry's head. In one corner stood a tall, dark mirror resting against the wall. Beside it were a pile of books and an iron brazier full of ashes. Dirk took the lantern from Theirry and hung it to a nail on the wall. " I have been studying," he whispered, " how to raise spirits and see into the future. I think I begin to feel my way." His great eyes suddenly unclosed and flashed over his companion. " Have you the courage?" " Yes," Theirry said hoarsely. " For what else have I left my home, if not for this?" " It is strange we should have met," shuddered Dirk. Their guilty eyes glanced away from each other. Dirk took a piece of white chalk from his pocket and began drawing circles, one within the other on the centre of the floor. He marked them with strange signs and figures that he drew carefully and exactly. Theirry stayed by the lantern, his handsome face drawn and pale, his eyes intent on the other's movements. The upper part of the vault was in darkness. Shadows like a bat's wings swept either side of the lantern that cast a sickly yellow light on the floor and the slender figure of Dirk on one knee amid his chalk circles. When he had completed them he rose, took one of the books from the corner and opened it. " Do you know this?" With a delicate forefinger he beckoned Theirry, who came and read over his shoulder. " I have tried it. It has never succeeded." " To night it may," whispered Dirk. He shook the ashes out of the brazier and filled it with charcoal that he took from a pile near. This he lit and placed before the mirror. " The future — we must know the future," he said, as if to himself. " They will not come," said Theirry, wiping his damp forehead. " I heard them once, but they never came." " Did you tempt them enough?" breathed Dirk. " If you have mandrake they will do anything." " I had none." " Nor I. Still one can force them against their will, though it is — terrible." The thin blue smoke from the charcoal was filling the vault. They felt their heads throbbing, their nostrils dry. Dirk stepped into the chalk circles holding the book. In a slow, unsteady voice he commenced to read. As Theirry caught the words of the blasphemous and horrible invocation, he shook and shuddered, biting his tongue to keep back the instinctive prayer that rose to his lips. But Dirk gained courage as he read. He drew himself erect, his eyes flashed, his cheeks burnt crimson. The smoke had cleared from the brazier. The charcoal glowed red and clear. The air grew hotter. It seemed as if a cloak of lead had been flung over their heads. At last Dirk stopped. " Put out the lantern," he muttered. Theirry opened it and stifled the flame. There was now only the light of the burning charcoal that threw a ghastly hue over the dark surface of the mirror. Theirry drew a long, sighing breath. Dirk, swaying on his feet, began speaking again in a strange and heavy tongue. Then he was silent. Faint, muttering noises grew out of the darkness, indistinct sounds of howling, sobbing. " They come," breathed Theirry. Dirk repeated the invocation. The air shuddered with moanings. "Ah!" cried Dirk. Into the dim glow of the brazier a creature was crawling, the size of a dog, the shape of a man, of a hideous colour of mottled black. It made a wretched crying noise and moved slowly, as if in pain. Theirry gave a great sob and pressed his face against the wall, but Dirk snarled at it across the dark. " So you have come. Show us the future. I have the power over you, you know that." The thin flames leapt suddenly high. A sound of broken wailings came through the air. Something ran round the brazier. The surface of the mirror was troubled as if dark water ran over it. Then suddenly was flashed on it a faint yet bright image of a woman, crowned and with yellow hair. As she faded, a semblance of one wearing a tiara appeared, but blurred and faint. " More!" cried Dirk passionately. " Show us more." The mirror brightened, revealing depths of cloudy sky. Against them rose the dark blue of a gallows tree. Theirry stepped forward. With a sharp sound the mirror cracked and fell asunder. A howl of terror arose, and dark shapes leapt into the air to be absorbed in it and disappear. Dirk staggered out of the circle and caught hold of Theirry. " You have broken the spell," he gibbered. " You have broken the spell." An icy stillness had suddenly fallen. The brazier flickered rapidly out, and even the coals were soon black and dead. The two stood in absolute darkness. " They have gone," whispered Theirry. He wrenched himself free from Dirk's clutch and fumbled his way to the ladder. Finding this by reason of the faint patch of light overhead, he climbed up through the trap door, his body heaving with long drawn breaths. Dirk, light-footed and lithe, followed him and dropped the flag. " The charm was not strong enough," he said through his teeth. " And you " Theirry broke in. " I could not help myself. I saw them." Dirk moved into the workshop and came back with the candle and a great green glass of wine. He held up the light so that he could see the scholar's beautiful agonized face, and with his other hand gave him the goblet. Theirry looked up and drank silently. When he had finished the colour was back in his cheeks. Dirk took the glass from him and set it beside the candle on the window sill. " What did you see in the mirror?" he asked. " I do not know," answered Theirry wildly. " A woman's face." "Eh?" broke in Dirk. "Now what was she to us? And a figure like the Pope." He smiled derisively. "I saw that," said Theirry. "But what should they do with holy things? And then I saw—" Dirk swung round on him, each white despite the candlelight. "Nay, there was no more after that." "There was," insisted Theirry. "A stormy sky and a gallows tree." His voice fell hollowly. "The foul little imps!" Dirk said passionately. "They deceived us." "Will you continue these studies?" Theirry questioned. The other gave him a quick look over his shoulder. "Do you think of turning aside?" "Nay, nay," answered Theirry. "But one may keep knowledge this side of things blasphemous and unholy." Dirk laughed hoarsely. "I have no fear of God," he said in a thick voice. "But you are afraid of Satanas. Well, go your way, each man to his master. Mine will give me many things. Look to it yours does the like by you. Listen to me, I am not afraid. Nay, why did I leave Courtrai?" With resolute, starry eyes Dirk gazed up at Theirry, who was near a head taller, and his proud mouth curled a little. "I may not disregard the fate that sent me here," continued Theirry. "Will you come with me? I can be loyal. Together might we do much, and it is ill work studying alone." The younger man put out his hand. "If I come, will you swear a pact with me of friendship?" "We will be as brothers," said Theirry gravely, "sharing good and ill." "Keeping our secret?" whispered Dirk. "Allowing none to come between us?" "Yes." "You are attuned to me," said Dirk. "So be it. I will come with you to Basle." He raised his strange face. In the hollowed eyes, in the full colourless lips, were a resolution and a strength that held and commanded the other. "We may be great," he said. Theirry took his hand. The red candlelight was being subdued and vanquished by a glimmering grey that overspread the stars. The dawn was peering in at the window. "Can you sleep?" asked Theirry. Dirk withdrew his hand. "At least I can feign it. Balthasar must not guess. Get you to bed. Never forget to-night and what you swore." With a soft, gliding step he gained the door, opened it noiselessly and departed. Theirry stood for a while listening to the slight sound of the retreating footfall. Then he pressed his hands to his forehead and turned to the window. A pale, pure flush of saffron stained the sky above the roof line. There were no clouds, and the breeze had dropped again. In the vast and awful stillness Theirry, feeling marked, set apart, and defiled with blasphemy, yet elated also, in a wild and wicked manner, tiptoed up to his chamber. Each creaking board he stepped on, each shadow that seemed to change as he passed it, caused his blood to tingle guiltily. When he had gained his room he bolted the door and flung himself along his tumbled couch, holding his fingers to his lips, and with strained eyes gazing at the window, so he lay through long hours of sunshine in a half swoon of sleep. End of section 3. Recording by Molly Craig. Section 4 of Black Magic by Marjorie Bowen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1, Chapter 4, The Departure. He was at length fully aroused by the sound of loud and cheerful singing. My heart's a nun within my breast, so cold is she, so cloistered cold. Theirry sat up, conscious of a burning, aching head and a room flooded with sunshine. To her my sins are all confessed, so wise is she, so wise and old, so I blow off my loves like the thistle down. A burst of laughter interrupted the song. Theirry knew now that it was Balthasar's voice, and he rose from the couch with a sense of haste and discomfiture. What hour was it? The day was of a drowsing heat. The glare of the sun had taken all colour out of the walls opposite the grass and vines. They all blazed together, a shimmer of gold. "So I blow off my loves like the thistle down, and ride from the gates of Courtrai town." Theirry descended. He found Balthasar in the workshop. There were the remains of a meal on the table, and the knight, red and fresh as a rose, was polishing up his sword handle, singing the while, as if in pleased expression of his own thoughts. In the corner sat Dirk, drawn into himself and gilding the devil. Theirry was conscious of a great dislike to Balthasar. Ghosts, nor devils, nor the thought of them had troubled his repose. There was annoyance in the fact that he had slept well, eaten well, and was now singing in sheer careless gaiety of heart. Yet what other side of life should a mere animal like Balthasar know? Dirk looked up, then quickly looked down again. Theirry sank on a stool by the table. Balthasar turned to him. " Are you sick?" he asked, wide-eyed. " Something sick," Theirry answered curtly. Balthasar glanced from him to Dirk's back, bending over his work. " There is much companionship to be got from learned men, truly," he remarked. His blue eyes and white teeth flashed in a half amusement. He put one foot on a chair and balanced his glittering sword across his knee. Theirry averted a bitter gaze from his young splendour, but Balthasar laughed and broke into his song again. " My heart's a nun within my breast, so proud is she, so hard and proud, absolving me she gives me rest." " We part ways here," said Theirry. " So soon?" asked the knight, then sang indifferently. " So I blow off my loves like the thistle down, and ride through the gates of Courtrai town." Theirry glanced now at his bright face, smooth yellow hair and gorgeous vestments. " Ay," he said, " I go to Basle." " And I to Frankfort. Still we might have kept company a little longer." " I have other plans," said Theirry shortly. Balthasar smiled good-humouredly. " You are not wont to be so evil-tempered," he remarked. Then he looked from one to the other, silent both and unresponsive. " I will even take my leave." He laid the great glittering sword across the table. Dirk turned on his stool with the roll of gilding in his hand. At this cold gaze that seemed to hold something of enmity and an unfriendly knowledge, Balthasar's dazzlingly fresh face flushed deeper in the cheeks. " Since I have been so manifestly unwelcome," he said, " I will pay for what I have had of you." Dirk rose. " You mistake," he answered. " I have been pleased to see you for many reasons, Balthasar of Courtrai." The young knight thrust his hands into his linked belt and eyed the speaker. " You condemn me," he said defiantly. " Well, Theirry is more to your mind." He opened his purse of curiously cut and coloured leather, and taking from it 4 gold coins laid them on the corner of the table. " So you may buy masses for the soul of Ursula of Rooselaare," he indicated the money with a swaggering gesture. " Think you her soul is lost?" queried Dirk. " A choired saint is glad of prayers," returned Balthasar. " But you are in an ill mood, master, so good bye to you, and God send you sweeter manners when next we meet." He moved to the door, vivid blue and gold and purple. Without looking back he flung on his orange hat. Theirry roused himself and turned with a reluctant interest. " You are going to Frankfort?" he asked. " Ay," Balthasar nodded pleasantly. " I shall see in the town to the hire of a horse and man, mine own beast being lamed, as you know, Theirry." The scholar rose. " Why do you go to Frankfort?" he asked. " All men go to Frankfort," Balthasar answered. " Is not the Emperor there?" Theirry lifted his shoulders. " 'Tis no matter of mine." " Nay," said Balthasar, who appeared to have been both disturbed and confused by the question. "No more than it is my affair to ask you, why go you to Basle?" The scholar's eyes gleamed behind his thick lashes. "It is very clear why I go to Basle, to study medicine and philosophy." They quitted the room, leaving Dirk looking covertly after them, and were proceeding through the dusty, neglected rooms. "I do not like the place," said Balthasar, "nor yet the youth, but he has served my purpose." And now they were in the hall. "We shall meet again," said Theirry, opening the door. The knight turned his bright face. "Like enough," he answered easily. "Farewell." With that and a smile he was swinging off across the cobbles, tightening his sword straps. Against the sun-dried, decayed houses, across the grass-grown square, his vivid garments flashed, and his voice came over his shoulder through the hot blue air. "So I blew off my loves like the thistle down, and rode through the gates of Courtrai town." Theirry watched him disappear round the angle of the houses, then bolted the door and returned to the workroom. Dirk was standing very much as he had left him, half resting against the table with the roll of gilding in his white fingers. "What do you know of that man?" he asked as Theirry entered. "Where did you meet him?" "Balthasar? Yea." "At his father's house. I taught his sister music. There was, in a manner, some friendship between us. We both wearied of Courtrai. So it came we were together. I never loved him." Dirk returned quietly to the now completely gilded devil. "Know you anything of the woman he spoke of?" he asked. "Did he speak of one?" Dirk looked over his shoulder. "Yea," he said. "Besides, I was thinking of another woman." They were his words. Theirry sat down. He felt faint and weak. "I know not. There were so many. As we travelled together he made his prayers to one Ysabeau, but he was secret about her, never his way." "Ysabeau," repeated Dirk. "A common name." "Ay," said Theirry indifferently. "What had he done if she had been living?" Dirk asked. Then, without waiting for a reply, he began swiftly on another subject. "I have finished my work. I wished to leave it complete. It was for the church of St. Bavon, but I shall not give it them. Now we can start when you will." Theirry looked up. "What of your house and goods?" he asked. "I have thought of that. There are some valuables, some money. These we can take. I shall lock up the house." "It will fall into decay." "I care not." With a clear flame of eagerness alight in his eyes, he flashed a full glance at Theirry, and seeing the young scholar pale and drooping, disappointment clouded his face. "Do you commence so slackly?" he demanded. "Are you not eager to be abroad?" "Ay," answered Theirry. "But—" Dirk stamped his foot. "We do not begin with buts," he cried passionately. "If you have no heart for the enterprise—" "Give me some food, I pray you," Theirry said, "for I ate but little yesterday." Dirk glanced at him. "I forgot," he answered, and set about rearranging the remains of the meal he and Balthasar had shared in silence. Theirry sat very still. The door into the next room was open, as he had left it on his return, and he could see the line of the trap door. He felt a great desire to raise it, to descend into the vault and gaze at the cracked mirror, brazier of dead coals, and the mystic circles on the floor. Looking up, his eyes met Dirk's, and without words his thought was understood. "Leave it alone now," said the sculptor softly. "Let us not speak of it before we reach Basle." At these words Theirry felt a great relief. The idea of discussing, even with the youth who so fascinated him, the horrible, alluring thing that was an intimate of his thoughts but a stranger to his lips, had filled him with uneasiness and dread. While he ate the food put before him, Dirk picked up the 4 gold coins Balthasar had left, and looked at them curiously. "Masses for her soul!" he cried. Did he think that I would enter a church and bargain with a priest for that?" He laughed, and flung the money out of the window at the nodding daisies. Theirry gave him a startled glance. " Why, till now I had thought that you felt tenderly towards the maid." Dirk laughed. " Not I. I have never cared for women." " Nor I," said Theirry simply. He leant back in his chair and his dreamy eyes were grave. " When young they are ornaments, it is true, but pleasant only if you flatter them; when they are overlooked they become dangerous, and a woman who is not young is absorbed in little concerns that are no matter to any but herself." The smile, still lingering on Dirk's face, deepened derisively, it seemed. " Oh, my fine philosopher," he mocked. " Are you well fed now and preaching again?" He leant against the wall by the window, and the intense sunlight made his dull brown hair glitter here and there. He folded his arms and looked at Theirry narrowly. " I warrant your mother was a fair woman," he said. " I do not remember her. They say she had the loveliest face in Flanders, though she was only a clerk's wife," answered the young man. " I can believe it," said Dirk. Theirry glanced at him, a little bewildered. The youth had such abrupt changes of manner, such voice and eyes unfathomable, such a pale, fragile appearance, yet such a spirit of tempered courage. " I marvel at you," he said. " You will not always be unknown." " No," answered Dirk. " I have never meant that I should be soon forgotten." Then he was beside Theirry, with a strip of parchment in his hand. " I have made a list of what we have in the place of value, but I care not to sell them here." "Why?" questioned Theirry. Dirk frowned. " I want no one over the threshold. I have a reputation, not one for holiness." His strange face relaxed into a smile. Theirry glanced at the list. " Certes! How might one carry that even to the next town? Without a horse it were impossible." Silverware, glass, pictures, raiment were marked on the strip of parchment. Dirk bit his finger. " We will not sell these things Master Lukas left to me," he said suddenly. " Only a few, such as the silver and the red copper wrought in Italy." Theirry lifted his grave eyes. " I will carry those into the town if you give me a merchant's name." Dirk mentioned one instantly, and where his house might be found. " A Jew, but a secretive and wealthy man," he added. " I carved a staircase in his mansion." Theirry rose. The ache in his head and the horror in his heart had ceased together; the sense of coming excitement crept through his veins. " There is much here that is worthless," said Dirk, " and many things dangerous to reveal, yet a few of those that are neither might bring a fair sum. Come and I will show you." Theirry followed him through the dusty, sunny chambers to the store rooms on the upper floor. Here Dirk brought treasures from a press in the wall: candlesticks, girdles with enamel links, carved cups, crystal goblets. Selecting the finest of these he put them in a coffer, locked it and gave the key to Theirry. " There should be the worth of some gulden there," he said, red in the face from stooping, and essayed to lift the coffer, but failed. Theirry, something amazed, raised it at once. " 'Tis not heavy," he said. " Nay," answered Dirk, " but I am not strong," and his eyes were angry. Theirry was brought by this to give him some closer personal scrutiny than as yet he had. " How old are you?" he asked. " 25," Dirk answered curtly. " Certes!" Theirry's hazel eyes flew wide. " I had said 18." Dirk swung on his heel. " Oh, get you gone," he said roughly. " And be not over long, for I would be away from this place at once. Do you hear? At once." They left the room together. " You have endured this for years," said Theirry curiously. " And suddenly you count the hours to your departure?" Dirk ran lightly ahead down the stairs, and his laugh came low and pleasant. " Untouched, the wood will lie forever," he answered, " but set it alight and it will flame to the end." Section 5 of Black Magic by Marjorie Bowen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1, Chapter 5, Comrades. They had been a week on the road and now were nearing the borders of Flanders. The company of the other had become precious to each, though Theirry was grave and undemonstrative, Dirk changeable and quick of temper. Today, however, the silence of mutual discontent was upon them. Open disagreement had happened once before, at the beginning of their enterprise, when the young sculptor resolutely refused, foolishly it seemed to Theirry, to sell his house and furniture, or even to deliver at the church of St. Bavon the figures of St. Michael and the Devil, though the piece was finished. Instead, he had turned the key on his possessions, leaving them the prey of dust, spiders, and rats, and often Theirry would think uneasily of the shut-up house in the deserted square, and how the merciless sunlight must be streaming over the empty workroom and the daisies growing upon the grave of Balthasar's wife. Nevertheless, he was enthralled to the attraction of Dirk Renswoude. Never in his life had he been so at ease with anyone, never before felt his aims and ambitions understood and shared by another. He knew nothing of his companion's history, nor did he care to question it. He fancied that Dirk was of noble birth. It seemed in his blood to live gently and softly. At the hostel where they rested, it was he who always insisted upon the best of accommodation, a chamber to himself, fine food, and humble service. This nicety of his it was that caused the coolness between them now. At the little town they had just left, a fair was in holding, and the few inns were full. Lodging had been offered them in a barn with some merchants' clerks, and this Theirry would have accepted gladly, but Dirk had refused peremptorily, to the accompaniment of much jeering from those who found this daintiness amusing in a poor traveller on foot. After an altercation between the landlord and Theirry, a haughty silence of flashing eyes and red cheeks from Dirk, they had turned away through the gay fair, wound across the town and out on to the high road. This led up a steep mountainous incline. They were carrying their possessions in bundles on their backs, and when they reached the top of the hill they turned off from the road on to the meadows that bordered it, and sank on the grass, exhausted. Theirry, though coldly angry with the whim that had brought them here to sleep under the trees, could not but admit it was an exquisite place. Dirk sat apart, resting his back against the foremost of the pine trees. The cause of the quarrel had ceased to be any matter to Theirry. Indeed, he could not but admit it preferable to lie here than to herd with noisy beer-drinking clerks in a close barn, but recollection of the haughty spirit Dirk had discovered held him estranged still. Yet his companion occupied his thoughts. His wonderful skill in those matters he himself was most desirous of fathoming. The strange way in which they had met, and the pleasure of having a companion so different from Balthasar, of a kindred mind, however whimsical his manner. At this point in his reflections Dirk turned his head. " You are angry with me?" he said. Theirry answered calmly, " You were foolish." Dirk frowned and flushed. " Certes, a fine comrade." His voice was vehement. " Did you not swear fellowship with me? How do you fulfil that compact by being wrathful the first time our wills clash?" " I am not wrathful," Theirry smiled, " and you have had many whims, none of them have I opposed." Dirk answered angrily. You make me out a fantastical fellow. It is not true." " It is true you are as nice as a girl," Theirry answered. " Many a time I would have slept by the kitchen hearth — ay, and have done, but you must always lie soft as a prince." Dirk was scarlet from brow to chin. " Well, if I choose," he said defiantly. " If I choose, as long as I have money in my pocket to live gently "" Have I interfered?" interrupted Theirry. " You are of a lordly birth, belike." " Yea, I am of a great family," flashed Dirk. " Ill did they treat me — no more of them. Are you still angry with me?" He rose. The red cloak slipped from his shoulders to the ground. He stood with his hand on his hip, looking down at Theirry. " Come," he said gravely. " We must not quarrel, my comrade, my one friend. When shall we find another with such aims as ours? We are bound to each other, are we not? Certes, you swore it." Theirry lifted his beautiful face. " I do like you greatly," he answered, " and in no wise blame you because you are weakly and used to luxury. Others have found me over gentle." " Then I am pardoned?" Theirry smiled. " Nay, I do regret my evil humour. The sun was fierce and the bundles heavy to drag up the hill." Dirk sank down upon the grass beside him. " Truly I am wearied to death." Theirry considered him, panting a little. Dirk stretched himself his full length on the blowing grass. The young scholar, used and indifferent to his own great beauty, was deadened to the effect of it in others, and to any eye Dirk could be no more than well looking. As Theirry studied him he spoke. " My heart, it is sweet here — oh, sweet." Faint airs wafted from the pine, and the wildflowers hidden in the woods below them stole through the grass. A glowing purple haze began to obscure the valley, and where it melted into the sky the first stars shone, pale as the moon. Overhead the dome of heaven was still blue, and in the tops of the pines was a continuous whispering of the perfumed boughs one to another. " Now wish yourself back in the town among their drinking and swearing," said Dirk. " Nay," smiled Theirry, " I am content." The faint purple colour slowly spread over everything. The towers of the town became dark, and little sharp lights twinkled in them. Dirk drew a great breath. " What will you do with your life?" he asked. Theirry started. " In what manner?" " Why, if we succeed in any way, if we obtain great power, what would you do with it?" " I would be great," Theirry whispered. " Like Flaccus Alcuin, like Abelard, like Saint Bernard." " And I would be greater than any of these — as great as the Master we serve can make his followers." Theirry shuddered. " These I speak of were great, serving God." Dirk looked up quickly. " How know you that? Many of these holy men owe their position to strange means. I, at least, would not be content to live and die in woollens when I could command the means to clothe me in golden silks." The beautiful darkness now encompassed them. Below them the lights of the town, above them the stars, and here in the meadow land the night breeze in the long grass and in the deep boughs of pine. " I am but a neophyte," said Theirry after a pause. " Very little have I practised of these things. I had a book of necromancy and learned a little there. But "" Why do you pause?" demanded Dirk. " One may not do these things," answered Theirry slowly, " without great blasphemy." Dirk laughed. " I care nothing for all the angels and all the saints. I desire vast wealth, huge power. I would see nations at my footstool. Ah, but I have a boundless ambition." He sat up suddenly and softly, and laid his hand on Theirry's arm. "If they, the evil ones, offered you that, would you not take it?" Theirry shuddered. "You would, you would!" cried Dirk. "And pay your soul for it, gladly." The scholar made no answer, but reclined motionless, gazing over the human lights in the valley to the stars beyond them. Dirk continued, "See what a liking I have for you, that I tell you this, that I give you the secret of my power to come." "'Tis my secret also," answered Theirry hastily. "I have done enough to bring the everlasting wrath of the Church upon me." Gradually, by ones and twos, the lights in the town were extinguished, and the valley was in darkness. Theirry folded up his cloak as a pillow for his head and lay down in the scented grass. As he fell into a half sleep, the great sweetness of the place was present to his mind, torturing him. He knew by the pictures he had seen that paradise was like this, remote and infinitely peaceful, meadows and valleys spreading beneath a tranquil sky. He knew it was desirable and that he longed for it, yet he must meddle with matters that repelled him, even as they drew him with their horror. He fell into heavy dreams, moaning in his sleep. Dirk rose from beside him and walked up and down in the dark. The dew was falling. His head uncovered, he stooped, felt for his mantle, found it and wrapped it about him, pacing to and fro, with calm eyes defying the dark. Then finally he lay down under the pines and slept, to awake suddenly and find himself in a sitting posture. Like wine poured into a cup, light began to fill the valley and the hollows in the hills. Faint mystic clouds gathered and spread over the horizon. Dirk shudderingly drew his mantle closer. Theirry sighed and woke. Dirk gave him a distracted glance and turned away so rapidly and softly that Theirry, with the ugly shapes of dreams still riding his brain, cried out, "Is that you, Dirk?" and sprang to his feet. Dirk stayed his steps halfway to the pines. "What is the matter?" he asked in an odd voice. Theirry pushed the hair away from his forehead. "I know nothing." The air seemed suddenly to become colder. The hills that on all sides bounded their vision rose up stark from grey mists. An indescribable tension made itself felt, like a pause in the stillness. Dirk stepped back to Theirry and caught his arm. They stood motionless, in an attitude of expectancy. A roll of thunder pealed from the brightening sky and faded slowly into silence. They were looking along the hills with straining eyes. On the farthest peak appeared a gigantic black horseman outlined against the ghostly light. He carried a banner in his hand. It was the colour of blood and the colour of night. For a moment he sat his horse motionless, facing towards the east. Then the low thunder pealed again. He raised the banner, shook it above his head, and galloped down the hillside. Before he reached the valley he had disappeared, and at that instant the sun rose above the horizon and sparkled across the country. Theirry hid his face in his sleeve and trembled terribly, but Dirk gazed over his bent head with undaunted eyes. End of section 5. Recording by Molly Craig. Section 6 of Black Magic by Marjorie Bowen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 1, Chapter 6, The Lady. Through the blue pointed arches that gave on to the sunny gardens, a thin stream of students issued from the lecture room. Behind the castellated roof of the university, the mountains appeared, snow cold against the sunlit sky. At the bottom of the gently sloping garden lay the town of Basle, with the broad blue Rhine flowing between the glittering houses. The students came in twos and threes and little groups, laughing together over the doctor who had been lecturing them, over some point in their studies that had roused their amusement, or merely because it was a relief after being confined for hours in the dark hall. The long straight robes, dark shades of purple, blue and violet, fluttered behind them in the summer wind as they gradually dispersed to right and left among the trees. Theirry, walking with two others, looked about him for Dirk, who had not attended the lecture. " We are going up the river," said one of his companions. " We have a fair sailing boat. It will be pleasant by Ovid." " Will you come?" asked the other. Theirry shook his head. " Nay, I cannot." They came to a pathway bordered with laurels and dark glossy plants, and from a seat amid them Dirk rose at their approach. He was distinguished from the others by the greater richness of his dress. His robe, very voluminous and heavy, was of brown silk. He wore a gold chain twisted round his flat black cap, and his shirt was of fine lawn, laced and embroidered. The two students doffed their hats in half mocking recognition of the exquisite air of aloofness that was his habitual manner. He gave them a steady look out of half closed eyes. " Hast learnt much to day?" he asked. " Aristotle is not comprehended in an afternoon," answered the student, smiling. " And I was at the back. Master Joris of Thuringia yawned and fell off his stool asleep. The doctor was bitter." " It was amusing," said the other. " Yet he was not asleep, but swooned from the heat. Mass, but it was hot. Where were you?" " Improving my Latin in the library. This afternoon I have put the story of Tyros and Philomena into the vulgar tongue." " Give you good even." The two linked arms. " We know a joyful inn up the river." As they disappeared Dirk turned sharply to Theirry. " Did they ask your company?" " Yea." Dirk frowned. " You should have gone." " I had no mind to it. They are foolish." " Ay, but we are beginning to be remarked for closeness in our habits. It would not be pleasant should they — suspect." " 'Tis not possible," said Theirry hastily. " It must not be," was the firm answer. " But be not churlish or over reserved." " I wish for no company but thine," replied Theirry. " What have I in common with these idlers?" Dirk gave him a bright, tender look. " We need not stay here over long," he answered. " I do think we know all this school can teach us." Theirry put back the laurel bough that swung between them. " Where would you go?" he asked. It was noticeable how in all things he had begun to defer to the younger man. " Paris, Padua," flashed Dirk. " Would you consider that? One might attain a reputation, and then — or one might lecture in any large town — Cologne, Strasbourg." " Meanwhile?" " Meanwhile I progress," was the whispered answer. " I have essayed some things. Will you come to my chamber to night?" "Eh? Secretly?" Dirk nodded. His grave young face under the student's flat hat was slightly flushed. He laid his hand on Theirry's arm. " I have something to tell you. Here it is scarcely wise to speak. There is one who hates me — Joris of Thuringia. Now good bye." His great eyes lit with a look of strong affection that was flashed back in Theirry's glance. They clasped hands and parted. Theirry looked after the brown silk clad figure as it moved rapidly towards the university. Then he took his own way, out of the gardens on to the hillside away from the town. With his hands clasped behind his back and his handsome head bent, he followed aimlessly a little path. And as he wound his way through the trees, wild daydreams stirred his blood. He was on the eve of putting himself in possession of immense power. These evil spirits whom he would force to serve him could give him anything in the world. Anything in the world. Presently a human sound forced itself on Theirry's senses, insistently, even through his abstraction, the sound of weeping, sobbing. He started, gazed about him with dazed eyes, like a blind man recovering sight, and discerned a lady upon the other side of the stream, seated on the grass, her head bowed in her right hand. Theirry paused, frowned, and hesitated. The lady, warned of something, glanced up and sprang to her feet. He saw now that she held a dead bird in her left hand. Her face was flushed with weeping, her long yellow hair disordered about her brow. She gazed at him with wet grey eyes, and Theirry felt it imperative to speak. " You are troubled?" he asked, then flushed, thinking she might term it insolence. But she answered simply and at once. " About him I am." She held the little brown bird out on her palm. " He was on the small poplar tree and singing. He held his head up so," she lifted her long throat, " and I could see his heart beating behind the feathers. I listened to him — oh, with pleasure." Fresh tears started to the eyes that she turned on Theirry. " Then my miserable cat that had followed me leapt on him and slew him. Oh, I chased them, but when I got him back he was dead." Theirry was extraordinarily moved by this homely tragedy. It could not have occurred to him that there was matter for tears in such a common thing. But as the lady told the story, holding out, as if secure of his sympathy, the poor little ruffled body, he felt that it was both pitiful and monstrous. " You may chastise the cat," he said, for he saw the elegant, soft animal rubbing itself against the stem of the poplar. " I have beaten her," she confessed. " You can hang her," said Theirry, thinking to console still more. But the lady flushed up. " She is an agreeable cat," she answered. " She cannot help her nature. Oh, it would be an odious cruelty to hang her. See, she does not understand." Theirry, rebuked, was at a loss. He stood looking at the lady, feeling helpless and useless. She wiped her eyes with a silk handkerchief and stood in a piteous, meek silence, holding her dead bird in a trembling hand. " If you buried it," suggested Theirry desperately, " I do think it would have wished to be buried here." To his joy she brightened a little. " You think so?" she asked wistfully. " Certes," he reassured her eagerly. " See, I have a knife. I will make a pleasant grave." She stepped to the edge of the stream, as near as she could to him, and because she came unconsciously with no thought for anything save the bird in her hand, Theirry thrilled with a great pleasure, as should a wild deer come fearlessly. " I cannot cross, the water is too wide," she said. " But will you take him and make his grave?" She went on one knee among the sorrel leaves and daisies. Theirry had a swift picture of her as she leant forward, stretching her arm towards him over the stream that divided them. Her pale red dress rippled about her on the grass, her curls and her veil were blown back from her face. Theirry knelt and held out his hand. Over mid-stream their fingers touched. He took the bird and she drew back hastily. As he, still on his knees, looked at her, he saw that she was no longer unconscious. She stood erect, as if commanding herself not to fly, and, as she was very slender, He likened her to the pale crimson pistil of a lily which has yellow on the head. Her hair, he told himself. " I am vexed to trouble you," she spoke haltingly. There were so many things he wished to say in answer to this that he said nothing, but took his knife from his belt and cut a little square of turf. " You are a clerk from the college?" she asked. " Ay," he answered, and wished fiercely he could have given himself a finer name. " There are many learned men there," she said courteously. He would not have believed it possible to find in himself such care over a trivial thing as he now took over this little bird's grave, for he knew she watched him with judgment in her eyes. The unholy daydreams that had vexed and enthralled him were completely forgotten in this new feeling. The lines of a verse he had not noticed when he read it came back to him, beating in his head. Pleasant is she of a fair white favour, sweetly her caress as the ripe grape's flavour, and her lips are like the rose in their savour. Seeing her my pulses quicken, I turn from common things and sicken for the quiet woods where the May buds thicken. Hearing her my breath is taken, my bold heart bowed and shaken, and I from sloth at last awaken." He dug into the soft brown earth with the point of his knife, lined the grave with leaves and picked up the little bird. For a moment he held it in his hand as she had done, and he dared not look at her. Then he laid it in the ground and replaced the grass and daisies. When he raised his head, his face flushed from stooping, he saw that she was no longer watching him, but she had turned sideways and was gazing at the distant woods. Theirry rose from his knees. She turned. " I thank you," she said. Then, on a quick breath, " Do you often come here?" " Nay, never before. I did not know the place." " That is my home yonder," said the lady. "Yours?" and he pointed to the castle walls. " Yea, I am an orphan and the Emperor's ward." She looked at the point of her shoe showing beneath her pale crimson robe. " What town do you come from?" she asked. " Courtrai." " I know no town save Frankfort." A silence fell between them. The wicked grey cat walked in a stately manner along the edge of the stream. " I shall lose her," said the lady. " Good even, gentle clerk. My name is Jacobea of Martzburg. Perhaps I shall see you again?" He had never felt more desirous of speaking, never less capable. He murmured, " I do hope it," and coloured burningly at his awkwardness. She gave him a half look, a flash from grave grey eyes, instantly veiled, and with an unsmiling mouth bade him again, " Good even." Then she was gone after the cat. He saw her hasten down the side of the stream, her dress bending the grasses and leaves; he saw her stoop and snatch up the creature, and, holding it in her arms, take the path towards those lordly gates. He hoped she might look back and see that he gazed after her, but she did not turn her head, and when the last flutter of pale red had disappeared he moved reluctantly from the place. On the slopes that adjoined the garden of the college Theirry came upon a little group of students lying on the grass. Just beyond them the others were standing: Dirk, noticeable by his rich dress and elegant bearing, and another youth whom Theirry knew for Joris of Thuringia. A glance told him there were words between them. Even from where he stood he could see Dirk was white and taut, Joris hot and flushed. He crossed the grass swiftly; he knew that it was their policy to avoid quarrels in the college. " Sirs, what is this?" he asked. The students looked at him. Some seemed amused, some excited. His heart gave a sick throb as he saw that their glances were both unfriendly and doubtful. One gave him half scornful information. Thy friend was caught with an unholy forbidden book, though he denies it. He cast it into the river sooner than allow us a sight of it, and now he is bitter with Joris's commentary thereon. Dirk saw Theirry and turned his pale face toward him. This churl insulted me, he said, yea, laid hands upon me. A burst of half angry, half good-humoured laughter came from Joris. I cannot get the little youth to fight, by Christus his mother. He is afraid because I could break his neck between my finger and thumb. Dirk flashed burning eyes over him. I am not afraid, never could I fear such as thee, but neither my profession nor my degree permit me to brawl. Be silent and be gone. The tone could not fail to rouse the other. Who art thou, he shouted, to speak as if thou wert a noble son? I did but touch thy arm to get the book. The rest joined in. Certes, he did no more, and what was the book? Dirk held himself very proudly. I will no more be questioned than I will be touched. Fine words for a paltry Flemish knave, jeered one of the students. Words I can make good, flashed Dirk, and turned towards the college. Joris was springing after him when Theirry caught his arm. " 'Tis but a peevish youth," he said. The other shook himself free and stared after the bright figure in silk. " He called me a son of a Thuringia thief," he muttered. A laugh rose from the group. " How knew he that? From the unholy book?" Joris frowned heavily. His wrath flared in another direction. " Yach, silence, son of a British swineherd, thou red face." The group seethed into fisticuffs. Theirry followed Dirk across the gardens. End of section 6. Recording by Molly Craig.